Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Hep United. We are a national coalition co-chaired by the Hepatitis B Foundation and the Association of Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations. My name is Kate Morales. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Health at the Hepatitis B Foundation and Director of Hep United. This month, as we're in the midst of recognizing and observing Hepatitis Awareness Month, today we'd like to focus that discussion on discrimination, hepatitis-related discrimination. This session will be talking about discriminatory practices against students applying to or enrolled in health profession schools who are living with hepatitis B. Our speakers will share cases of discrimination against healthcare students with hepatitis B that have previously occurred, and as a result, federal legal protections for persons living with hepatitis B, the process for filing complaints, and we'll share preliminary research findings as well from an assessment of schools in 2 jurisdictions. So before we get started, I'd like to review a few logistics on how you all can participate in today's webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. If you encounter any technical difficulties with computer audio, you can also use the phone-in option on your control panel, and the conference line is shown here. And if you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen or in your control panel. And if you encounter any technical difficulties at all, please also feel free to send them in the question box, and we will hope to troubleshoot that for you. And to start off with, we'll just like to do a quick overview for those that are unfamiliar with hepatitis B and the state of hepatitis B in the U.S. There are an estimated 2.2 million Americans living with hepatitis B. However, a majority are unaware they are infected. And without diagnosis or treatment, 1 in 4 chronically infected will develop liver cancer or liver disease. And I want to note that as we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to be aware that older adults and those with underlying medical conditions, including liver diseases, might be at a higher risk of severe illness from COVID-19. Both the CDC and the American Association for the Study of Liver Diseases have great resources on hepatitis, liver disease, and COVID-19, and we'll be sure to share those resources with you on the follow-up. So hepatitis B can be transmitted in a number of ways, from infected mother to her baby at birth or perinatal transmission. This is the most common route of transmission worldwide. Through exposure to infected blood, unprotected sex, drug use, and unsterilized needles. Unfortunately, very few people are screened in the U.S. for hepatitis B infection. There's low levels of awareness, including among healthcare providers. Testing is not routine in most healthcare systems. The good news is there are vaccines available, and while we have made progress in infant and childhood vaccinations, only a quarter of adults are vaccinated against hepatitis B. Back up. Hepatitis B is associated with significant health disparities in the U.S. Asian American, Pacific Islander, and African immigrant communities are disproportionately impacted. And I wanted to note that new surveillance data also reveal ongoing disparities in healthcare access, with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders experiencing the highest hepatitis B mortality rates. Hepatitis B is one of the barriers of screening and treatment that we'll be discussing today is fear of stigma and discrimination. I wanted to share a couple of stories here related to stigma among communities that are highly impacted. Sorry. And I'll read one of those stories out loud to you. Kat's father has hepatitis B. But nobody in the family is willing to talk about it. For years, they weren't allowed to share the same chopsticks or eat dinner with him. As she grew older, she learned how hepatitis B is actually spread and shared this information with the family. Similarly, Bunmi, whose family is from Nigeria, she had not learned about the reasons for her father's death until his passing. And it was on his death certificate that she found out it was liver cancer that was related to hepatitis B. And it was because of her family's unwillingness to talk about hepatitis B and superstitions about it and the stigma related to it in Nigeria. This is very common amongst those communities, and it's caused by both stigma and discrimination are caused by low levels of awareness, misconceptions and myths about hepatitis B, and biases and judgments about transmission, which can lead to discrimination. We know that discrimination against hepatitis B occurs in both professional and personal environments. So today we'll be focusing on discrimination in academic institutions, which then translates to also discrimination in the workplace. So before we get started, before I introduce our panelists for today, I wanted to do a quick poll to see where everyone is, whether everyone is aware, whether it's true or false. Let me pull up the poll real quick. All right. True or false, hepatitis B is considered a disability and is a protected condition under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'll give it a minute or so. All right. Great. I'm going to close the poll and share the results here. Interesting. So 65% say true, 35% false. So the answer is true. And so we're going to take a deeper dive into that and how it came about today. Thank you for participating. All right, well, now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists for today and go over the agenda. Our first speaker will be Nadine Sharoma. Nadine is a civil rights advocate and has been a policy advisor for the Hepatitis B Foundation for many years. Nadine handles all of our discrimination cases that come through our helpline. And Nadine will share a little bit about the history of the cases that we're going to be talking about today. Then we will move on to Susana Lorenzo-Giguer, who is a former trial attorney in the Disability Rights Section with the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. So Susana was instrumental, and she will also walk us through the history of how she got involved and how the ADA applies to people with hepatitis B. And finally, Daniel and I, Daniel Lohan, who is currently an MPH candidate at Columbia University. Daniel was with the Hepatitis B Foundation as a Health Equity Fellow in the summer of 2019. And he will be sharing preliminary results from an assessment of schools in New York City. We took a look at these schools to find out whether these policies were discriminatory or not. And then I'll be sharing the same findings that we conducted from Pennsylvania healthcare schools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nadine. And Nadine, don't forget to unmute your line.
Hello, sorry about that. Obviously, I'm still learning. Thank you for joining us today. As you've just learned from our poll, for those who weren't aware, hepatitis B is a protected disability, but it was not always so. Policies and practices that excluded students with chronic HBV from schools, healthcare schools and programs did not occur overnight. It's very different from the experience that occurred in, for example, the HIV/AIDS community. For the most part, most people didn't even know that such policies existed. Kate, can you forward to the next? Okay, thank you. Most people didn't even know that such policies existed, and the complexity of the disease made it difficult sometimes for schools to explain, but it also served to provide cover for policies that were, or to rationalize policies that were unfair and were not even disclosed to students when they applied. At the time, the schools felt that they could not openly state, very few, there were only a few schools and a couple of states that said students with HBV will not be accepted. And for the most part, schools did not want to be seen as discriminating against people with HBV. But then it took some other turns whereby, for example, an immunization policy might say that all students must have proof of immunization for Hep B, as well as titer readings to show that they have antibodies and are immune. But unless you know you have it, and we know that more than 50% of the students were not even aware, those who were not permitted to enroll were not even aware, and even those who were aware could not discern a policy that directly impacted them. Then we have, I just want to, it's a lot to digest if you were interested in that, but it goes on, it continues, even though we have policy today. And this is what Daniel and Kate will describe a little bit more later on how this can still be occurring if it's already been determined to be protected. Then we have the lack of knowledge within foreign-born communities who continue to be disparately impacted by chronic HBV. And this graph is just gives you an illustration of the incidence or the rate of chronic HBV in the U.S.-born and foreign-born. It doesn't even include the children of foreign-born, because obviously they would be included in the blue lines down at the bottom. But it just shows you how over the period 1980 to 2008, the incidence of this disease has definitely shifted to those who are foreign-born. And so when you have that lack of information in the larger community, is it any wonder that we didn't even know that it existed, the disease existed, much less that such discrimination was occurring and growing among schools? Now, when I say growing, not all schools had that policy, which made it even more difficult for students to identify where those who knew they had the disease. It made it more difficult for those students to know what they had to be aware of and deal with. Okay, the next slide. And the most important is the fact that these schools were relying on outdated and misinterpreted recommendations. These recommendations were put forward by the CDC in 1991, had not ever been updated to reflect the new technology, new medications, antiviral treatment. And in fact, one school told a dental student or a prospective student who was not allowed to enroll that they could not allow him to enroll because dentistry involves sharp instruments. So they took a line from that policy and turned it and said, well, we're using sharp instruments, therefore you can't enroll in this program, despite the fact that the state in which the school is located allowed dentists with HBV to practice. So in terms of advocacy, for those of you who are familiar or have done advocacy, it's really a question of constantly asking lots of questions to identify where there might be discrimination and how it works. And as I said, HBV is very tricky to understand, and for every question, there were many more questions. Next slide. Prior to 2011, students who had difficulty who were told that they could not do their clinical rotations or who were simply not allowed to enroll were handled on an ad hoc basis. If they happened to call to find that there was a Hepatitis B Foundation, because there was no advocacy, national advocacy at the time. And so there was never really, we don't even know how many students were in fact affected at this point and who may have never have received the help that they deserve. By 2011, the number of cases, numbers of calls, from students who were in danger of being dismissed or who simply weren't being allowed to enroll had grown. And it was necessary to take formal action. First, for the Hepatitis B Foundation to gather hepatitis B specialists to meet with the CDC, to inform them of the discrimination that was occurring, and convince the agency of the need to issue separate, updated, and clearly defined recommendations for HBV-infected healthcare workers and students. I might also say that the prior CDC regulations had included information for people with HIV and HCV, both of which are similar yet very different diseases and involve different parts of the medical specialist dealing with bloodborne diseases. And so the fact that it was enmeshed with it made it very difficult to separate and for people to clearly understand, much less the fact that it was outdated. All of those things contributed to a big problem. The other issue that we took up was to file, and fortunately it occurred right after the meeting with the CDC, and that was to file complaints with the Department of Justice for two students who were accepted but not allowed to enroll at what is now Rutgers University, but at the time was the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, which encompassed 9 different healthcare schools. And within 3 months of those initial complaints, more complaints were filed for students at other healthcare schools, one of whom was not receiving accommodation, the other who was told they would have to seroconvert in order to remain, even though the individual was on antiviral treatment. He was told that he had to seroconvert in order to be allowed to participate in clinical. Next. So as a result of the advocacy by the specialists, and I want to point this out, how important the organization, Hep B Foundation and Hep B United, and your participation, those of you who are members of whose organizations, or as individuals, if you're members of Hep B United, why this type of advocacy organization is critical, because it was the result of that advocacy by the Hep B Foundation that allowed CDC, that convinced CDC to issue the new regulations. And again, it wasn't only to protect the students, it was to promote patient safety and provide risk management and practice guidance to the schools. And it's important to point out that the recommendations didn't just apply to doctors and dentists. It applied to all healthcare workers and providers, including nurses and other allied healthcare professions, as well as the students and residents. Quite often we might forget about that, but I'm sure that the current situation, the current pandemic has drove home. It's made us much more aware of the broader healthcare profession. Next slide. So in terms of the highlights of the 2012 CDC recommendations, again, it described instances in which individuals were threatened with dismissal or actually dismissed, or were having their acceptances rescinded. It's important, again, because it drives home how important, why we need to hear from people or from their allies and supporters. We need to know and have it received by DOJ, and for us to know just what we are dealing with, because, again, discrimination is ongoing. The CDC recommendations called for the use of HBV DNA serum levels rather than simply a hepatitis B antigen status that would allow them to monitor infectivity. And it established a threshold value of less than 1,000 international units per milliliter of serum HBV DNA for healthcare professionals who performed what was considered and defined by CDC in this in these recommendations as Category 1 invasive exposure-prone procedures. And these types of procedures would normally require oversight by expert review panels. Next slide. And so when I say that, referring to that, those types of invasive and exposure-prone procedures, CDC categorized them in those that were known and likely to pose an increased risk of percutaneous injury and potential transmission. And now I've included the information here because I think it really drives home and allowed people to understand what was really considered Category 1 and would require the person to have a viral load of less than 1,000 IUs per milliliter. And also, where previously they said, for example, as I said, the dental school said, had indicated, just because we use sharp instruments, that makes you ineligible. And this set it straight. It's important information, and I hope you'll review it later or look it up in the actual regulation. And next slide. And then it defined all other invasive and non-invasive procedures that would not require such oversight or viral loads of less than 1,000. And I think it provides very detailed information that leaves less to people's feelings or their own biases or opinions. Next slide. So I want to point out in closing that any policy is only effective if it's implemented fairly and violations are reported. And when I say fairly, policies can be worded in ways that we would not expect to be discriminatory, and yet they very well could be, especially if they lead someone to an incorrect conclusion. So it's important to be aware, to call it out. And Hepatitis B Foundation continues to receive calls from nursing students, from medical students, or people working in hospitals. And so we and the Department of Justice need to be apprised of these occurrences. And lastly, there are people who were harmed before we even had a formal complaint and formal CDC update of the guidelines. And it's unfortunate, but it's not unusual. And so if you become aware of someone who is being denied access, being denied a license, even if it occurred before 2013, please advise us and help them to report it and be a part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for providing us with that history and the CDC recommendations. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Susanna.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for hosting this, Kate and Hepatitis B Foundation. And I do have to give kudos to Nadine and to Sherry Cohen at the Hepatitis B Foundation for their staunch and persistent advocacy. And without that advocacy, we wouldn't have been able to do the work that we did when I was over at DOJ. Okay, so I'm just going to start here. For copyright reasons, I just need to say that segments of this presentation are drawn from my June 11, 2013 article. The DOJ settled its first ADA hepatitis B bias claim in the legal Untitled Chapter. Next slide. What is the ADA? The Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. It is an equal opportunity law for people with disabilities to enjoy the same opportunities as everyone else in employment, in purchasing goods and services, and in participation in state and local government programs and services. Disability is defined by the ADA as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. The ADA does not specifically name all of the impairments that are covered. Next slide. How does hepatitis B satisfy the criteria of an ADA protected disability? For those 35% that weren't sure, here's the answer. In 2008, Congress amended the Americans with Disabilities Act to clarify the meaning and interpretation of the 1990 ADA definition of disability. A major life activity now includes the operation of a major bodily function. So this is included but not limited to functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. Hepatitis B is a physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, including the functions of the liver, a major bodily function which operates in the digestive system. Accordingly, under the ADA as amended, the DOJ found that an individual with hepatitis B has a disability within the meaning of the amended ADA. Next slide. How do protections of the ADA apply to people with hepatitis B? Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA prohibit entities, including public and private schools of higher education, from denying participation to students and applicants with hepatitis B. Title 1 of the ADA prohibits employers, including hospitals and medical or dentistry practices, from discriminating against employees with hepatitis B. The ADA requires these entities to make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, or procedures when the modifications are necessary to avoid discrimination on the basis of disability, unless that modification would fundamentally alter the nature of the program or the services provided. Next slide, please. When do the ADA protections not apply? An entity may exclude a person with a disability when the individual poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others or to themselves in an employment context. In determining whether an individual poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, schools must make an individualized assessment based on a reasonable judgment that relies on current medical knowledge or the best available objective evidence to ascertain 1, the nature, duration, and severity of the risk, 2, the probability that the potential injury will actually occur, and 3, whether reasonable modifications of policies, practices, or procedures will mitigate that risk. Consistent with Supreme Court decisions, the Department of Justice places considerable weight on guidance from public health authorities like CDC when analyzing whether there had been a violation of the ADA. And in Bragdon v. Abbott, the court noted that when conducting a direct threat analysis, the views of public health authorities, such as the CDC, are of special weight and authority. Next slide, please. In July 2012, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released recommendations for health-related schools regarding the education of healthcare students who have hepatitis B in its updated recommendations for the management of healthcare providers and students with hepatitis B. And as Nadine mentioned, the purpose was to promote patient safety while providing risk management and practice guidance to students and healthcare providers with hepatitis B. The CDC recommendations are based on the most current scientific information. They dispel many myths associated with hepatitis B and provide guidance to hospitals, healthcare facilities, and health-related schools on managing students and healthcare providers with the virus. Importantly, the CDC recommended that medical and dental students with chronic hepatitis B virus infection who do not perform exposure-prone invasive procedures, but who practice non- or minimally invasive procedures should not be subject to any restriction of their activities or study. In fact, the CDC noted that since its last update in 1991, there had been no reports of hepatitis B transmission in the United States or other developed countries from medical or dental students or any others who would not normally perform exposure-prone invasive procedures. Among other things, the CDC provides the following additional new recommendation for the management of healthcare students who have hepatitis B. And Nadine went through many of these. I'll just briefly mention that the chronic hepatitis B virus infection itself should not preclude the study or practice of medicine, surgery, dentistry, or allied professions. Practices that restrict students from the study of medicine, dentistry, or surgery, such as pre-notification to patients of the hepatitis B status of their healthcare provider, should be discouraged. And while medical and dental students with chronic hepatitis B virus infection may have restrictions imposed on their participation in exposure-prone invasive procedures, the CDC found that exposure-prone invasive procedures are not ordinarily performed by students fulfilling the essential functions of a medical or dental school education. The next slide, please. Right before discussing our first settlement agreement, I do want to say that the disability rights section at the Department of Justice was pleased to participate in that update of the CDC guidance in a consultative position. The settlement between the United States of America and University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey was DOJ's first ADA hepatitis B enforcement action. We settled it on March 5th, 2003. Next slide, please. In 2011, the DOJ received complaints that UMDNJ Medical School and School of Osteopathic Medicine rescinded offers of admission to 2 Asian American applicants after learning that they had hepatitis B. UMDNJ admitted that it excluded the applicants because of their hepatitis B. They said that the applicants posed a direct threat to the health or safety of others. The applicants could infect patients while performing exposure-prone invasive procedures because of the applicants' high viral loads of hepatitis B. They also claimed that such procedures were essential to the curricula, were required for graduation, and could not be modified to accommodate the applicants without fundamentally altering the nature of their program. Next slide, please. The DOJ investigation revealed, and this is included in the settlement agreement, that during all relevant periods of time, neither the New Jersey Medical School nor the School of Osteopathic Medicine actually required that its students perform exposure-prone invasive procedures. Moreover, neither the New Jersey Medical School nor the School of Osteopathic Medicine currently requires that its students perform Category 1 procedures as defined by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And that was the list that Nadine showed you, which really is limited. It is not a broad and undefined list. And those procedures are not required in order to graduate. The United States determined that UMDNJ discriminated against the complainants by excluding them from participation and denying them the benefits of services, programs, and activities of UMDNJ on the basis of their disability. The United States further determined that because the complainants would not be required to perform exposure-prone invasive procedures as a condition of graduating, the UMDNJ could not show that the complainants posed a direct threat to the health or safety of others. The next slide, please. DOJ concluded that the university's exclusion of the applicants violated Title II of the ADA. The terms of the settlement agreement required UMDNJ to adopt the Hepatitis B non-discrimination policy, to train its employees on the requirements of the ADA, to admit the applicants into their program, and to provide a total of $75,000 in compensation and tuition credits to the two applicants. Next slide, please. On June 12, 2013, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, and the Department of Health and Human Services jointly sent a letter to the nation's medical schools, dental schools, nursing schools, and other health-related schools regarding hepatitis B discrimination. Next slide, please. The joint letter emphasized the importance of the updated CDC recommendations, especially as they relate to the institution's non-discrimination obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It cited the Institute of Medicine's 2010 data that approximately 800,000 to 1.4 million people in the United States have hepatitis B, which according to the Journal of Viral Hepatitis has only grown. It describes that DOJ, ED, and HHS share responsibility for protecting the rights of students and applicants with disabilities, including those with hepatitis B, in schools of higher education. CDC notes instances where people were dismissed from their surgical practices or others who had their acceptances to medical or dental schools rescinded on the basis of their hepatitis B infection. And it also describes the March 2013 DOJ settlement with UMDNJ. Next slide, please. The letter updates the schools on the latest recommendations from CDC. It reiterates that CDC's updated recommendations provide current medical information about the management of students in health-related schools who have hepatitis B. And we've reiterated those between Nadine's presentation and mine. It also found that some health-related schools may be making enrollment decisions based on an incorrect understanding of hepatitis B, resulting in discrimination. And that is also what Nadine was describing. It emphasizes the school's obligations to comply with the federal law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability, race, color, and national origin. And it notes that while Asians, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders make up roughly 4.5% of the U.S. population, they represent 50% of the persons with hepatitis B in the United States. Title VI applies to the extent that specific policies, practices, or procedures regarding hepatitis B discriminate or have the effect of discriminating against students or applicants of a particular race, color, or national origin. It strongly urges schools to review their policies practices, and procedures regarding students and applicants with hepatitis B in light of CDC's updated recommendations, and to ensure that their institution is complying with its non-discrimination obligations under the ADA, Section 504, and Title VI. Next slide, please. If you have questions about the ADA or hepatitis B, please contact the Hepatitis B Foundation, the ADA information line, or ada.gov. And you can see the links here on how to file a complaint online with the Department of Justice, either online, by mail, or by fax, and then also how to file an employment claim with the EEOC. We've had questions about being able to file anonymously, and I just wanted to mention that according to the ada.gov, DOJ will not disclose your name or other identifying information about you from your complaint unless it's necessary for enforcement activities against an entity alleged to have violated federal law, required to be disclosed under the Freedom of Information Act, or if it's, a disclosure is permitted pursuant to the Privacy Act or is otherwise required by law. And the complaints that we've discussed with UMDNJ were filed anonymously. That's what I have. I look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for attending. I am so pleased to have been able to partner with Hepatitis B Foundation and Nadine Shiroma on moving this important matter forward.
Thank you, Susanna, very much. I can't emphasize that enough how absolutely critical it is, and want to reemphasize what Susanna said about individuals filing a formal complaint with the ADA, the Disability Rights Office. The more complaints we have, the more it's on record, the more there is data, and it's helpful for our continued advocacy efforts. So as you've heard from Nadine, despite the settlement agreement, despite the updated CDC recommendations, we continue at the Hepatitis B Foundation to receive phone calls from students and nurses as well, current healthcare workers that are encountering discriminatory policies. Because of that, and we do believe that this is only the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of underreported situations that are going on. And because of that, we had decided to look into some schools, healthcare schools policies. And we chose Pennsylvania to start. That is where we are headquartered. And I want to acknowledge Alexa Canizzo and Sherry Cohen, who conducted the preliminary assessment of the healthcare schools. So I wanted to share with you all what we found when we went through these policies. So the research question that we had was, are health profession schools in Pennsylvania compliant with the federal guidance from 2012 and 2013 and the laws to protect students with hepatitis B? Alexa conducted a content analysis using a survey question that she developed. And the information that we found were all publicly available via a Google search. So we went through school websites, student handbooks, physical forms, for example. And the programs that were analyzed include MD, DO, physician assistant or PA, dentistry, licensed practical nurse, and registered nursing school program. And everything was documented in an Excel sheet. So just to go over how we defined discriminatory policies, and these are based on the current legal framework from the DOJ ruling. So a school is considered discriminatory to students with HB infection if the policy, and Nadine mentioned this as well, requires proof of immunity to HB infection and doesn't permit a student without immunity to enroll or participate in clinical rotation. So they're asking for titers, for example. Requires that a person is not infected with HBV for that student to enroll or start clinical rotations. Requires students to disclose their HBV infection to school administrators as a condition of acceptance or attendance, and especially if the school doesn't have policies in place to protect and accommodate the students. These accommodations are, as Susanna and Nadine mentioned, outlined in the CDC recommendations. So if a student is dismissed or revoked because of their HBV infection, admission is revoked because of their HBV infection, and that's what happened in the UMJ case. Or a student's educational track or clinical experience is altered because of their HB infection, with or without their consent. And we have heard of cases where a student has completed their first year of training before clinical rotations, spent thousands of dollars, and then was denied to move on to clinical rotations. And then finally, if the policy requires an infected student to maintain a viral load below a specific threshold, even though they're not required to perform invasive exposure-prone procedures as defined by the CDC recommendations. So the results are we analyzed 83 schools in Pennsylvania, schools of higher education that were accredited health professions programs. And our preliminary results showed that 31 programs, or 37%, had policies that appeared to be satisfactory. They aligned with the CDC recommendations, and they had policies in place for the management of students with chronic hepatitis B. So they had accommodations in place. Then we did find that 36 programs, or 43%, had policies that appeared to be discriminatory based on the criteria I just went over. And then 16 programs, or 19%, had unclear policies. So we're not sure exactly just by what we found. So those will require follow-up to determine what the consequences for the students will be if they are positive for HBV or negative for immunity. And it's interesting to point out that 34 out of 36 programs that had discriminatory policies also had in place anti-discriminatory policies based on disability. So this showed that there is a lack of awareness of appropriate policies, a lack of awareness of federal legal protections, and that there is also a lack of clear policies and transparency. This continuing to be a deterrent for students who are pursuing healthcare careers. So now I will hand it over to Daniel, who conducted a similar assessment of New York City health profession schools.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Lohan, and it is my pleasure to be sharing this information with you all. I know Kate and others at the Hepatitis B Foundation have been trying to organize this presentation for a while now, and so I'm really happy that we are hosting this presentation for you all today. In this presentation, I'll be providing an overview of my preliminary findings from the analysis that I conducted on New York City health professional schools and their hepatitis B policies. Before I get started, I also wanted to mention that for this analysis, I used the same discriminatory policy criteria and methodology that Kate went over in her presentation. Next slide, please. As Kate previously mentioned, I had the privilege of working on this project during the summer of 2019 at the Hepatitis B Foundation. Since then, some of these policies and my findings may have been updated, and so my findings may not necessarily reflect those new changes. So using the same discrimination framework, I analyzed a total of 43 schools in New York City, including schools in the Bronx, Queens, Manhattan, Staten Island, and Brooklyn. At the time this analysis was conducted, 14 schools, or 31% of schools, had policies that aligned with the CDC recommendations for healthcare providers and students that Susanna and Nadine discussed earlier. One school in particular had an exemplary policy regarding students who may be living with hepatitis B. And this school is the SUNY Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. In their student handbook, it reads that the college may not require a test for verification of other communicable diseases, for example, hepatitis B, for the purpose of continued matriculation, which implies the inclusion of the clinical educational aspect of the student's program. In addition to this, the school also states within their policy that no person shall be subject to adverse education actions or removed from education experiences solely because of a non-task related disability. If a student is known to be infected with hepatitis B, an expert panel will be convened to review and recommend educational activities for that student. And so this is what I like to term as the golden policy, and so other schools should be following this sort of policy as well. Unfortunately, however, not all schools have similar policies in place. In my analysis, I found that 19 health professional schools, or 43% of the schools analyzed in New York City, discriminate against students who may be affected with hepatitis B. For example, the Touro College of Osteopathic Medicine, located in Harlem, states within their student handbook that no students will be permitted to begin and attend clinical rotations if they have not provided proof of required immunization, including those for hepatitis B. Using the criteria that we discussed earlier, this policy is overtly discriminatory against students affected by hepatitis B because it requires proof of immunity and can significantly alter the educational trajectory of the student. And finally, in schools, or 23% of the schools analyzed have ambiguous/unfound policies, meaning more information is needed because nothing could be found on the internet, or their policies were questionable in the way that it was written, as Kate mentioned in her previous slide. This is especially important to note because if a student is admitted and matriculates into a health professional school or program, not knowing certain procedures and policies regarding claims for hepatitis B, this may lead to a host of issues later down the line in their educational trajectory. We believe that schools, in addition to having policies that align with CDC recommendations, schools should also make this information readily accessible for current and prospective students. So as we can see, much like in Pennsylvania, New York City health professional schools also have a lot of work to do, right? Around changing their policies for people affected with hepatitis B. And so I believe that this is why the work that we collectively are doing to raise awareness and advocate for socio-structural changes around hepatitis B is so important, as all the other panelists have spoken on. Thank you, and I'll pass the virtual mic back to Kate.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So, thank you to all our panelists for sharing this really valuable information. We really hope that today's presentation at least goes a little bit in increasing the awareness around this issue, and that this is still an ongoing problem, and that students who are thinking of healthcare careers and those that are working in the healthcare system should know that there are these legal protections in place. And I wanted to check to see if we have any questions. If you do have questions, please feel free to send them into the question box, and I will be sure to read those to the panelists. So I do have a question for any of our panelists, maybe Susanna or Daniel. Knowing that this is still going on, knowing that we are still experiencing these, we're still getting calls into the foundation, what strategies would you recommend in terms of addressing this on a more systemic level, making sure that schools have these policies in place? We can still conduct these state by state, city by city analysis, but that takes a lot of resources. How can we, at a higher level, address this issue?
I think it's important that this information gets relayed. It has to be gathered, like you're doing that at Hepatitis B Foundation. It also has to be relayed to the Department of Justice and Ed and HHS, so that together the organizations that are charged with enforcing these laws and those that are advocating for their protection can move this ball forward. I think it's important that this information and the stories are told.
I think also in addition to that, I think it's important to start holding schools accountable, especially in regards to their accrediting bodies, and raising awareness about these policies and the CDC recommendations. Accrediting bodies are aware that this is in place. I think even further, getting students who may be directly impacted by hepatitis B involved in the conversation on local college and university campuses, health professional schools, is a critical component as well.
Nadine, I think you're muted.
Hello?
Okay. We can hear you now.
I'm wondering, Susanna, is the information that we have now, granular information on 2 major jurisdictions, would be sufficient to file a follow-up complaint? Because this is something that I tried to do previously, but it was more of a cross-section, national cross-section of various school policies. But if we could follow up with a complaint with DOJ, that's my first as a possibility. And the other is that perhaps the foundation, or I would think the foundation would be the appropriate one, or any other allies, and to write again to the schools to advise them, because administrations change. The information, people don't always understand it and may not see the need to correct anything unless it's pointed out to them. I'm sorry, there was another. I would also like to involve some of the, reach out to the programs, the national organizations that manage information or manage applications for students, the admissions process. For example, the ADEA, American Dental Education Association, so that this information is more clearly stated for potential applicants, and especially in the year that they're actually applying. And that we encourage schools and organizations such as APAMSA that have pre-med or pre-dental. I'm sure there must be something in the dental profession and nursing professions to also, they have board members who manage programs for students who are pre-med, for example, to make this information more widely known.
Nadine, I think that those are really great ideas. And, Hepatitis B Foundation could possibly send the letter that was sent previously to those associations to remind them. Because I don't remember if those associations were included in the initial mailing of that joint letter. I think it was just to schools and not to, clearinghouses like that, like the ADEA that you're mentioning.
That's a great idea.
As far as whether that granular level information is sufficient, I'm not there anymore, so I don't know what is sufficient, but I think it's always helpful to provide that information.
Thank you.
We did see a couple of questions in the question box, and I wanted to get to them before we close out. First is, have the results of these studies been provided to the schools that have unsatisfactory policies? If so, have they changed their policies? To my knowledge, actually, I don't think we have provided them. We are actually in the midst of about to publish these findings. So they should be published in the public health reports this year, and that is something that we can definitely share with the schools. I will say that when our helpline consults receive a call with a problem like this, we contact the school and we share the information with them, the letters, the policy, the CDC recommendation settlement agreement. And once the school knows that there is a legal threat, they back down. And so that is good news. It just shows us that there's just a level of unawareness. There's not usually any hostility. But we do have to follow up to make sure that they do change their policies. Again, we can't just contact them and they change the policies, but we do want to make sure that these are on the record and filed with the ADA so that we do have this hard data and evidence behind our advocacy efforts. And then the other question that we received is just curious, is the policy all the same with hepatitis C? Have the same issues been faced? We at the Hep B Foundation haven't received any calls to my knowledge about students living with hepatitis C. And I wanted to ask if Susanna or Nadine or even Daniel, if you've encountered any issues, any similar issues.
At DOJ, we had a different claim about hepatitis C and discrimination. It's two men in a truck. It's our case against a moving company that refused to move the furniture of a resident because she had hepatitis C, and they thought they were going to get it if they touched her furniture. So we have had complaints about that, and that's one of the settlements that we had about hepatitis C.
In terms of a healthcare school, when the student was that I assisted, a dental student, this is prior to 2011, it was the year prior when I first learned about hepatitis B, the school actually stated that persons with HIV or Hep C should not disclose their conditions, and that they would be permitted, they could enroll, and they should actually leave their paperwork at home. So clearly there was a very different perception. And of course now with a cure for Hep C, it certainly makes it much easier for the person to not have the problem going forward, a person who may be diagnosed.
Unless they're incarcerated.
Right. But then there are elimination programs. Washington State now has a Hep C elimination program. So that is also becoming much more. Hopefully it will catch on because the medications were not easily accessed because of cost. But with states being more proactive, we may have more widespread availability.
That's good.
So I wanted to squeeze in one last question. This is from Joan. And she's asking, what kind of reassurance can we provide those who experience HPV-related discrimination to not be afraid to file a complaint, since their names could be revealed at some point?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Kate?
Sure. The question is, what kind of reassurance can we provide those who experience HPV-related discrimination to not be afraid to file a complaint, since their names could be revealed at some point?
I don't know. They did have to really reassure those complainants before that what they were doing was going to help them and would help many people after them. We did not reveal their names for, until we were well into the process, and we're well on our way to getting some relief. Their names aren't revealed if the complainant doesn't want them to be, and they can be anonymous for a while, but at some point the school is going to need to verify who it is. And I understand that creates a lot of fear for students who are trying to do well in school and want to keep a good academic record and don't want to risk losing their academic standing because they're making waves. That's really understandable. And all I can say is, Nadine and Hepatitis B Foundation have just done a tremendous job of advocating for these students and helping them understand that sometimes you need to put yourself out there a little bit. Initially you don't, but at some point you might need to put yourself out there for yourself and for people after you.
Well, what I found was very helpful is the fact that DOJ allowed myself as a third party to file the complaint. The students themselves didn't have to initially file the complaint. And then when we had some traction, when we knew that there was the potential, as we followed up on my complaint and opened an investigation, then they were more readily persuaded, because then they saw that there was something positive that was going to come out of their action. And I think now, having had some success, this is a huge success for the foundation and for people with hepatitis B and for the students. That with this, we hope that this will encourage more people to see that there is value in coming forward, and that sometimes things will not be righted, things will not be corrected unless people speak out, and we build on the work that's already been done.
And federal agencies won't know the extent of the problem unless people do come forward. They won't realize that there are complaints. I mean, Hepatitis B Foundation has done a tremendous job of resolving these on their own, so many of them. But I think simultaneously, notification or complaint process should be entered into with through DOJ with the ADA.gov, which is a website that goes directly to the Disability Rights Section, Civil Rights Division at DOJ, so that they also know what's going on out there, so they don't just think it's one and done. We have that claim and that's it. So we need to hear more. I think we need to let the story be told.
Exactly. Well, thank you all very much. I did see a comment come in. I just wanted to respond to that from a nurse program administrator who suggests that the letter has never seen this letter reference and that we could also disseminate it through the NCSBN, which is member boards of nursing for all states are members. So that's a wonderful idea, and I do think we should be getting that letter more widely promoted out there. So that is something that we are going to be working toward. Wanted to thank everyone for joining today. There were some questions about whether the presentation will be available. Yes, so this webinar is being recorded. We will post the recording as well as the presentation slides on happyunited.org within the next week. We'll be also sure to let you know when those are posted via a follow-up email message. And we'll also share some handouts from the presentation so you have a copy of the links to the letter that was sent to the schools, the CDC recommendations, as well as the DOJ settlement agreement that were included in Susanna's presentation. And also the filing of the complaints process. Thank you so much to Nadine, Susanna, Daniel for joining us, for your time, your advocacy. We really appreciate it. And for everyone for joining us today, there is the number there for the helpline. If you are experiencing or encountering discriminatory policies or know anyone that is, please call us anytime at 215-489-4900 or email us at info@hepb.org. We have staff on call to assist every day during the working hours. And please feel free to visit us on our website if you have any if you require additional information about hepatitis B or have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email info@hepb.org. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Daniel, Nadine, Kate. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.